Today, I'm excited to be joined by Cara Koscinski, who's an OTD, OTRL, CAS, and an expert in the area of executive functions. We'll be diving deeper into this topic, including recent research and actionable takeaways you can implement right away. Welcome to Pediatric Pioneers, a MedBridge podcast where we conquer challenging topics for the pediatric therapist through conversations with pioneers who have blazed new trails in our practice. Our aim is to deliver actionable takeaways for practitioners like you. To receive continuing education credit for this episode and access bonus resources, make sure you check out medbridge.com. Hello, I'm your host, Nicole Quint, and I'm an occupational therapist with over 20 years of experience in practice and academia, specializing in pediatric practice and the improvement of occupational participation and performance through my expertise on executive function, visual perception, social-emotional learning, sleep, and sensory processing. It is my passion to support pediatric therapists like you so that you can best serve the families under your care with evidence-based practice solutions, easy-to-implement advocacy approaches, and new ways to lean into your skills within the challenging pediatric landscape. Welcome, Cara.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm very excited to be here. This is a topic that's so exciting for me to share.
Well, we're happy to have you here. So I know you're excited about this topic. Could you get us started by sharing a little bit more about yourself and how you are involved with executive functions and neurodiversity, which is a topic that we are going to be talking about today?
Sure. I've been an occupational therapist since 1997. I started with my Master of Occupational Therapy degree. And I worked with adults for a few years and just didn't find my niche. I did burn unit, heart lung transplants, and it just wasn't, I just felt like I had wasted my education, which is a horrible thing to say. And then I had two children, and they were born in 2000 and 2002. And after birth, probably a few years after birth, they were both diagnosed as autistic. So I thought, well, let's learn everything we can about that. And at the time, the internet was new. So I started researching, and everything I wrote down and I made it into books because I didn't want any other family or OT to say, what do I do with kids like this? So that's how I started. And then I had a website called The Pocket OT, and I sold that. And I had started private practice, which is still in existence in Pittsburgh today. But I just still felt something was missing. And I thought it's, about our body. And that's when I started looking at interoception. And then there was still something that I felt was missing. So that's when I started into executive function, and it just started to click when I started to pull it together. And it just made such a difference for my students and for my own understanding of the way our body works every day.
And I know you also started the Executive Function Express program, right? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I did. So when I was looking at research I got my post-professional doctorate as an older adult. And when I started to look at the research, I thought, there's no framework. And the research for occupational therapy all across the world, I was looking at, the Canada research, and there was no framework for executive function, and there was no definition for it. So if we can't define a problem, how do we know how to work on it? So I thought a thorough definition was in order, and based on the research, I pulled it together. And then I thought this program could be really fun if we conceptualize executive function. And that's why the Executive Function Express was made, because I wanted to give everyone a clear definition and then further a visual model, because it's so much more easy to understand when we can say, oh, the child is the train. And from that book, I started the Executive Function Institute. And part of the work that I'm doing is just supporting professionals, teachers, caregivers on what executive function is and how we really need to start early, and not wait until mid adolescence, older or younger adulthood to work on executive function.
Yeah, that's really true. And I know
Mhm.
you have a fun story about why you chose trains as the visual model for your express approach to executive function.
I
Can you
do.
share that?
Yeah, a lot of people think, "Oh, you did the autistic kids like trains," and that's actually a stereotype that is antiquated because
Mhm.
a lot of people love trains, but my kids don't love trains. But when I grew up, I was in a small steel town in West Virginia, and there was a my dad worked there. Pretty much everyone's dad or mother worked at the mill, and we would see these hot trains full of steel and
Mm-mm.
slag and byproducts pass us through the center of town all the time. And I thought, and everyone said the same thing, that that's our lifeblood. If we didn't have that train with that hot slag or molten metal, we're not going to have, we're going to have be all out of a job. And it was like I just decided that trains were so important and meaningful, and that's why I picked the train. I got super interested in the process of transporting steel.
And it is kind of a universal language, right? Everyone knows what a train is and
Yeah.
kind of how they work, and
Yeah, so
you kind of
I looked at what is a mode of transportation that people around the world use. And I found that every single country except for two, I think, use trains. So it's a common language that's super
Mhm.
familiar to a lot of people. So people know what the engine is, what the track is. So it's relatable to a lot of people in the world. So that was important to me as well, not to have an abstract thing because we need to be able to see it and play with it and touch it to understand it.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for everyone to understand. So you've kind of given us a little background, talked about why it was important to you personally. But why do you think it's important for us to discuss executive functions? And I know you tie interoception to that very closely. And like, what questions should we be asking as therapists who work with folks who are neurodivergent, or maybe kids that have brain injuries or things like that, where executive function is a challenge? So, like, what should we be questioning as therapists out there working on this?
Well, first of all, we as therapists are getting pigeonholed into certain things, right? So a lot of us are
Mhm.
occupational therapy practitioners. We're getting pigeonholed into handwriting. And there's so much more referrals now for behavior. That's another issue that we're
Mhm.
seeing. And I just happen to own one of the large pediatric OT Facebook groups, and we have 52,000 plus members around the world. And the questions that come in, we get at least 20 questions every day. So
Wow.
many of them are saying we are getting referrals for behavior, for kids that have task initiation problems where they're not able to start a task. And it's like we really aren't behavior specialists. However, we are body specialists. So this process of embodied cognition really interested me. And it is where our body is linked to our brain, right? So in the model, the child is the train. So that any kind of train that the child wants, whether it's, a wooden train or if they can just picture a train, they're the train. And the person working with them is the engineer. So the train has to move. So the premise of the whole model is move the train to build the brain. And it's this embodied cognition where the body and brain are so linked in their thinking, and movement has to be a part of building executive function. And therapists are perfectly poised to work on this. We can look at crossing midline and that the brain and the body are always working together for a common goal. But another big piece is this interoception, right? So finding a comfort within our bodies is going to be critical. A lot of kids that are neurodiverse do struggle specifically with interoception. And what that means is that they may not recognize hunger, thirst, fatigue. They may feel stressed and overwhelmed and get to that state very quickly because of some unexpected threat or perceived threat in the environment. And that is when we see these behaviors come, is
Mm-hmm.
when the child is in a state where they're uncomfortable and they quickly go into a fight or flight or stress type reaction. So that's really
Mm-hmm.
important when thinking about behavior referrals at we're not working on the behavior itself, we're looking at the underlying comfort of the child.
So you're telling us that basically behaviors can be indicative of a child communicating that their interoception is affecting their basic needs, whether it's toileting, whether it's food related, hunger, discomfort of some kind. And I know emotions are tied into that. Do you also propose that sometimes the behaviors that people are seeing are really a manifestation of an executive function dysfunction, or they don't have that skill yet? For example, you said something about children not being able to initiate a task. Now, that could be interoception, but could it also be something related to executive functions?
It absolutely could. So, executive functions are tied to the child's comfort in the fact that when, let's just give an example. So, if the child's going uphill in the model, the child is again a train and they're going up a mountain. So, there's a cute little mountain. And again, you can imagine a train going up the mountain. And as the child is learning something, whether it's a non preferred task,
Mm,
or it's a task in which they haven't learned, so it's a new or novel task, the child has to use a lot more energy at that time. And by energy, I mean they have to have that interoceptive comfort. So they have to
mm,
have toilet, not have a bowel movement or constipation at the time because that's very uncomfortable. Also, when we expect them to learn these new things, we've got to give them a break. So the
mm,
station in the model is the interoceptive piece. When a train is fatigued or is struggling maybe to plan or organize a desk, we have to get them to a level where they're able to be comfortable. And that could mean a drink of water. That could
mhm,
mean making sure they have rest and they're well fed. But one of the other things that's really important is that we think of kids a lot as, oh, they're not motivated, right? They're not motivated. So if we
mm,
see a child with planning issues, or organization issues, we say, oh, they're lazy. So we're labeling them. But really, it's a foundational. Maybe they're so stuck in the moment that they don't know how to start. So we need to just give them a lot of support in the form of different accommodations, scaffolding, and a visual timer and visual plan. So we've got to support executive function after we know that they're in a state that's ready to learn and comfortable.
mhm. Yeah, and so, I think you talk about this as like a body first lens with the kids,
Mhm.
and that kind of ties in the motor piece, but also the interoception. Can you kind of, you said that the child is the train, the interoception is the station, and then we're looking at uphill as the energy and downhill with the train, kind of like the difficulty of the
Mhm.
task, right?
Yes.
So that kind of tells us about the visual model that you've created. So what about, are there some other pieces of this model that will help us understand how you work with kids on this executive function, how they understand how everything interrelates, and as the therapists have to know it as well?
Sure. There we have to look at ways that we can make this all tangible. I wanted to also say that with kids that are struggling, or with kids that are less verbal or don't have the skills yet, we can use things such as rhythm and timing. We do know that executive function is a timing issue as well.
Mm,
So we have to use the movement, right? When if we're going to work on the timing issues. But through the program, the map represents the plan. So we
mm,
can easily give a child a plan and have them draw the map or the steps to achieve it. We have time management, of course, is the clock, but for time management, we know that that's a very abstract concept. And a lot of children that have neurodiverse issues, they don't. It's abstract. Things are hard, right? It's not a black and white concrete thing. So we have to make time more concrete for them in the form of playing with time and getting to know time and thinking not just about. So we have this podcast. It's got to be, however long, we have some goals to meet in that time. But if a child doesn't even understand the time and what it feels like or looks like, then they may struggle with getting things done in a certain amount of time. And that's where movement and rhythm and obstacle courses that we're already doing as clinicians can be used effectively to work on executive function if we add a cognitive piece to the movement we're already doing.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I like that whole idea, and you're really talking about um, what their nervous system is able to support in that moment,
Right, right.
right?
And if you think about it, I have a concept in the program called alligator and eagle brain. And we know that as soon as kids that are generally, a lot of kids that we're working with are kind of really quick to have a stress response. So their
Mhm.
stress responses can be those fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses. And they
Mhm.
happen so quickly because the actual fear center of the brain, the amygdala, is larger because it has the principle of use it or lose it. And the
Mhm.
more kids live in a state of angst, the more they're likely they are to go into this alligator brain where they're losing the cognitive piece in the frontal lobe. And at that point, there's no access to thinking that's possible. So they're going to need to go through this chemical release of cortisol and acetylcholine. And then when those hormones are absorbed, then they're going to be able to go into eagle brain or thinking brain and use that frontal lobe. But we have to understand that a lot of kids live in a stressful situation. So
Mhm.
building in the comfort is very important, and helping them to advocate for what makes their body feel good is going to be critical to access the higher level executive function.
So it really, you're starting to think about this. There's a lot going on physiologically, the nervous system's involved. There's all these kind of, the chemicals and everything like that. So, and I can tell that you've put it all together with your model. So tell us a little bit, because we're always thinking evidence based here. What
Mhm.
does the recent research say? I know that executive functions is a hot topic. I know you're saying that you're getting a lot of referrals for this in the clinic, and you're hearing about it from people on your Facebook group. But what does the recent research say? And can you give us some highlights of what the important takeaways are in the literature?
I would love to. The research is currently saying that this is linked. You know, before we thought
Mm.
interoception was separate from the executive function, and the research is saying, hey, wait a minute, it's so linked that we used to believe, Nicole, that executive function, which it still does. Let me just preface that with, it's supposed to mature fully by age 25. And
Mhm.
even when I was doing some presentations recently to groups of therapists, they said, why work on this in pediatrics when it just matures at 25? But there's no
Mm.
poof
Right. Yeah.
maturation. These things start at birth. And when we're in early intervention, when we're in preschool and the elementary years, we can absolutely work on executive function because
Mhm.
the research is saying that it's developing at young age. It even has to do with the way we're playing. So
Mhm.
infant play and young preschool play in again, crossing midline, working on turning the body at the trunk, rotation. Those are all building executive function. The research says that gesturing starts to build
Mm.
executive function. Another big thing is that by, I think it's kindergarten, if a child is struggling with reading comprehension and math, there is going to be a gap that continues to grow
Mm.
throughout their schooling. In other words, if we don't work on executive function at a young age, the gap in incongruency between their intelligence level and what they can show on testing is growing and growing. And
Mhm.
that's maybe why we're seeing a lot of kids that are struggling in adolescence. So, this is all in the research, and it's showing that we can't ignore this at all.
Yeah, and I think once you're kind of labeled as a behavior problem,
Hmm.
that is sticky, and that can follow children through the school experience. It's a label that unfortunately, or the lazy label,
Ugh,
that can follow them. And so if it's tied to executive functions, it makes an interoception and all of this brain body relationship, it makes sense to work on it early. And we know we can make more of a difference early on too, right?
right, because the plasticity is there, and we've got kids that are more willing to try different things. And
Mm,
play is the way that we can do this. And, from the perspective of, yes, this is not an issue of, it's an issue of basically skill versus will. We tend to make this a will
mm,
issue where we say, like you said, labeling. And my own sons were both labeled. And as a mom, I could see that killed their self esteem. That
mm,
really was hard because they knew they were struggling. And we know that kids know that there's something that they're struggling with, which is why if we don't address this earlier, then we're going to end up with depression, anxiety, and different, stressors later on in life. But when we think about executive function in terms of this, the kids aren't broken or unmotivated, they don't have the skill to
mhm,
support what they're supposed to do. And we can kind of think about this, Nicole, as like COVID. When COVID hit, we all got disoriented and we all
mhm,
became dysregulated. And it's like we couldn't plan for the future. We couldn't look at organization. We couldn't do those things because we were stuck in the stress, here and
mhm.
now. And I think if we think about it, how it relates to us as adults, we can better understand that this is something that's really affecting our kids in a way that we've got to work on it now.
Yeah, that's a great that really is helpful to compare it to that experience because I think everyone can
Yeah.
kind of appreciate what they went through or what they saw
Right.
others going through. Yeah.
Hmm.
So one of the things, thinking about research and just thinking about executive functions, one of the challenges you said was that there's always been lots of definitions. I know there's always kind of like this laundry list approach to here's all the executive functions, and people get a little overwhelmed. Where do I start? What do I do? What are some of the ways that we can? What does the research say about supporting executive functions? What are some of the factors that we need to consider?
That's a fantastic question. And it is a hard starting point. So great, there's this motto out there. And I understand that, that metacognition is looking at the scrapbook of, the journey, but where do we begin? So it begins with a referral. So when we get a referral or an evaluation request, we change our lens. We look at a sensory lens
Mm,
and we look at the responses of the child. So are we observing them in the setting, right? We've got to see what and when. And what are we seeing? So instead of saying child's refusing, we look at the actual child's body and say
mhm,
child is slouched or child is, squeezing hands. So we want to look for the child's body signs, and those are
mhm,
called physiological signs. So when we
mhm.
shift our lens, we want to start and say, oh, wait a minute, what is signaling, what is that train telling us about their body, and readiness cues. And then we want to look at like persistence. Are they able
Mm,
to continue with the task, or do they become tired? And a lot of times teachers will say, well, they put their head down at the desk. Yes, but
mhm,
did they slouch in their chair first? Were they overwhelmed? Did they have a visual schedule of what's first and next? So supporting kids with a visual schedule and making sure their feet are on the floor, in the classroom, is going to be important. But also flexibility is, I think, one of the big things that we see is trouble with transitions. And
mhm,
flexibility is really, really difficult for a lot of kids that we're working with. And when we look at that is, okay, why can this child not tolerate this change? And what can we do to support them to feel more comfortable? Do we need a visual timer? Do we need some scaffolding built in? So scaffolding in the executive
mhm,
function program is looked at as the tunnels and bridges. And we know that a
mhm,
tunnel doesn't get removed once the train goes through it. It's permanently supported. And that's okay if we have to permanently support a child. That's another
mhm.
biggie that we should consider clinically.
Right. It's not always just skill building. It could be, we always think, oh, it's skill building or remediation, but sometimes, a lot of times it needs to be just supporting with modifications or adaptations. So I'm hearing you say that there are factors like the posture is
Mhm.
big, right? Predictability. I'm hearing that.
Oh, yes.
We talked about emotional safety, and I always know you talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs
Mhm.
um, in this realm. So tell us a little bit about postural stability because
Mhm.
it's a big deal, and kind of this internal readiness with these factors and moving toward executive function building. If I'm working with a kid, you know, how does this play into that?
Great question. Absolutely. And posture is something that again, I started to write a book called Sensory Motor Interventions. And I was looking at how I can best support clinicians to look at vision and posture. And it really, from that, I created it's a non standardized assessment called the VAMPS, but looking at the vision, the posture, when children are used to, and we know that phones and devices are
Mhm.
causing a posterior pelvic tilt, which goes right into a slouch. And when that happens, we can't support breath. And we need to also think about movement. So in infants, movement starts front to back. And then they go side to side. But the transverse movement, so sitting and holding your hands on your hips and rotating, is really something that a lot of our kids struggle with. So
Mhm.
adding in the trunk rotation is really going to help them again with strengthening bilateral coordination, the gesturing on both sides. As far as timing, the research has shown that timing and rhythm in the form of music and beats and just the body is based on rhythm, like our circadian rhythms. That is supporting executive function as well. And when we link movement through patterns, that supports our flexibility and it supports our task initiation. And inhibition is also
Mhm.
thought about as rhythmic, right? So if we can do rhythms or movements side to side, we can stop, pause, and wait. And that helps build that inhibition. And working memory is built by sequences, and it's just all linked to timing, posture, and rhythm as well. It's really, the research is so interesting about the links.
And so, it's kind of interesting hearing all this come together. And these are things that OTs, we do this, we know this really well. This is our bread and butter. And I know you have a saying about moving the train. So I'm going to let you say it.
Yeah, move the train to build the brain. I was doing a posture. I do this one conference every year, and I started just to say that, but it's so true. If we don't move the train, we're not going to build the brain. So a
Mhm.
child does not learn without movement, and that's how our body's designed. It's to crave novelty, right? Rhythm and movement. So that's the biggest thing. Hopefully, you take away from this. Maybe is the move the train, build the brain.
Well,
So
we
important.
know that movement builds the brain. You've talked about some things about, obviously posture. You've talked
Mhm.
about the interoception. We now know that's interrelated with the
Yes.
research. You've talked about all these different things that are now supported by the research with executive functions. You brought up the dirty word, which is the phone. And I know that that's a big part of this. And I'm sure people are, right away kind of saying
Yeah.
kids they're on the phones too early. I mean, we're learning so much about the research with the phones. So I should bring that up. What does the research say about how that is playing into all of this?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. I was just looking at that yesterday because I'm doing a rewrite and another edition on my interoception work. And, the phone, one of the things that the phones are doing besides getting us in this curled up position is we have neck pain and soreness, but also it is really hurting a child's perception of time. And
Mhm.
when we think about the time we spend on a phone, when we go down a rabbit hole, it is so time consuming and so much time passes that we don't even realize it. And then we lose that rhythm and sense of timing again. We get stuck, and it's really hurting a child's time management and task initiation because they're just getting these, hits of dopamine and calming and these exciting hormones and calming hormones and exciting, but they're all pleasurable, and it
Mm,
just gets
yeah.
into addiction. But if we had a child doing some play-based activities that were physical instead of sitting at the phone, then again would be working on all of the beautiful skills that build executive function,
Well,
especially at those younger ages, Nicole.
yeah, and that leads back to the idea where you're saying persistence,
Yes.
right? Persistence matters. And
Yes.
and what happens when we don't really have that persistence and we need that dopamine hit, we could just jump over to the phone. It kind of creates this loop of maybe I initiated the task, but I can't stick with it. I don't have the
Right.
persistence. And
Right.
then when it gets challenging, I'm just going to bail out and go to the phone. And then that kind of feeds itself, right?
Absolutely. And if kids, one of the biggest things for metacognition, we can tie that in so well right here, is that metacognition is one of the highest forms of thinking
Mhm.
because it involves thinking about our thinking. And if we don't learn from our mistakes and we're always getting that, oh, this is right, this is fun, TikTok, this, it's like we're not making mistakes and learning from them. But if a child were playing, they would say, "Oh, wait, that didn't work. What could we do next time?" So we're seeing a lot of older kids that don't even want to start a task because they're so afraid of making an error. And then that gets them stuck in
Mm,
another vicious cycle. So that all comes from that lack of thinking about our thinking and making errors in play.
yeah.
Hmm.
So a lot to, kind of think about with all of this and making sure we're starting early, making sure we're thinking about all these factors that are important, thinking about the postural piece. So let's translate all this research chat into practice. So are there certain clients, are there certain conditions that this is most appropriate for?
It's really for anyone. And that's one of the biggest things is that when we're looking at executive function, we need to start it at any, early intervention and beyond. And it's not something we can just let go. But I can give you a case example of a 10-year-old. I have a couple case examples prepared. But so this 10-year-old was referred to us about difficulty starting tasks. So, in the world that we live in, unfortunately, this young man might be labeled as lazy or is someone that doesn't follow instructions, right? So he's disengaged, which is what we see. So when the work requires sustained effort, he just quits or doesn't start it at all. And in this case, the teachers report that he will sit quietly doing nothing during work time, watching everyone else, right? And then he becomes distressed when the teacher comes and yells at him, just start already, or what are you doing? And he's age appropriate in his intelligence, but he is suggest. So we look at that and think, okay, it's not his intelligence, or it's not that he wants to be, labeled. It's that he doesn't have access, or he's lacking the ability to access the task initiation. So when we look at a child like this, the observation here reveals that his body is showing those signs of increased overload.
Mm,
Shallow breathing. So, looking at breathing, and breathing is one of the biggest things that we can do for interoception, just as an aside. But his breathing becomes shallow. So, we already know based on that and the fact that his posture collapses that he
mm,
is having this physiological meltdown. So, he's not going to access the higher level thinking here. He's going to be
mhm,
stuck in that stress brain. At any rate, we know that he doesn't initiate. So what we could do then would be to think about his train, right? He's the train and he's stuck at the platform. So if we look at it again as the train is stuck, there's no good or bad. There's no judgment or labeling here. He's stuck. So we can then work on verbal prompts. We can break his steps down. We can look at strengthening his own regulation and readiness, maybe by giving him some movement prior to work. Seating then improves his postural stability, maybe pairing him with a peer buddy, even,
Mm.
or looking at just giving him more cues about his body before starting a task, especially if it's non-preferred. So that's maybe how we would work through the first case,
Mhm.
thinking about it from a different lens, the executive function lens.
So yeah, so this is your body first
Mhm.
lens,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so eh, and that's going to move away from that kind of labeling,
Oh,
um our judgment against this child. So how do you talk about executive function challenges with the
yeah.
train model to kind of help us understand how you just went through that case? Because
Well,
that case
I'm
was really helpful.
Well, I hope so. I have a ton of them. If anyone wants more, they can let me know. But this, but the thing is, yes, learning through these cases is going to be critical because it's like, how do I? Yes, this framework is here, but what do I do? But it's really thinking again about embodied cognition. Again, it's our mental
Mhm,
processes that are shaped by our body. It's not just that we express the thoughts that come to our head; it's that we participate. And, thinking about that is that our cognitive status is affected by our environment. Everything around us, the sounds that we hear, the lighting above us,
mhm,
it's all affecting us. And we know this as clinicians already, but we maybe don't think about how it affects planning, task
mhm,
initiation, working memory. And if I say something like gesturing contributes to working memory, this might be something that could support our listeners' learning. Is that when we're doing a math problem, we might say, okay, 1, 2 plus 10. So we're counting on our fingers and
mhm,
we're using our hands together. And mathematics is big on gesturing and working memory, holding a thought in your head. And if you go from sitting here comfortably to a stress reaction, you're going to lose everything you were trying to remember. And this is obviously apparent with kids that have reading comprehension problems too, where they're not able to remember what they've just read. And that really affects a lot of kids we work with as well. And that's all linking body to brain.
mhm, mhm. Yeah. So, and I go back to this whole idea like you're teaching them like something's changed. So there's a signal that changed. The
Hmm.
terrain is maybe different. So now they have different, you were saying the energy goes when they're going uphill or
Hmm.
something. So the energy demands have increased. And
Yes.
so now what we're saying is we have to teach them not only are we building the skill, but do we have to adjust things? You were saying something about breaking down the task. Do we need to
Mhm.
adjust expectations? That sounds to me like we're educating some of the adults in their life, right? As well as them,
Absolutely.
maybe giving
Yes.
them some support with regulation, and all of these things. And again, everything that I hear you saying is right in our um, I would say not just skill set of pediatric OTs, and if SLPs are listening, they do all this stuff too,
Mhm.
or even PTs, or educators. We have these skill sets to support
Right.
these kids. It's just
Right.
kind of like we have to kind of pump the brakes a little bit and look at them from that different lens as well.
That's exactly
Right.
right. If, one of the things that when I started this model, I, of course, as an OT, had to relate it and my work in interoception to the occupational therapy practice framework, because that's what builds evidence based practice, right? Is when we can link this and can use consistency within our profession. And the language is there in the framework for at least for occupational
Mhm,
therapists. The
mhm,
language of executive function and interoception and timing, that is all in our scope of practice. So we can no longer say, oh, we don't do that. We're referring because hopefully, based on what you've been hearing, if we don't do it, we're not doing, we're trying our best, of course, but I feel like if we listen to this and do nothing, we're doing a disservice to our kids. And all we want to do is just build up our profession and our ability and really get the foundational information out. And there's lots of visuals in the program. I mean, the whole thing is visually
mhm,
based. So I've got a ton of helpful visuals, like with the track switch would be a change in a plan and
mhm.
what to do when there's a track switch. So, but yeah, you're right. This is definitely within our scope.
Hmm. So what do therapists need to consider, or when it comes to the perspectives of, I kind of brought up the other adults or the other,
Mhm.
interest holders, whether it's the kids, we have to talk to the kids and kind of explain some things to them, or the other care providers. So, are there
Yeah.
some talking points, some word choices, some strategies? Because I think I remember you earlier saying people just think everyone will just grow into their executive functions by 25. So, how do we get that buy in? How do we get, I actually think this question is kind of maybe twofold. How do we get the buy-in from the other interest holders and the kid? How do
Mhm.
you get the buy-in from OTs that say this isn't in their purview? Because I almost think I'm hearing both of these challenges, right?
Yes, absolutely. And the good thing is that we're asking questions, but we really kind of want everyone to be comfortable. So I would start with the fact that we as clinicians have a code of ethics, right? And as part of it,
Mhm.
we want our children to be comfortable. We want to make sure that they have access and can participate effectively in order to access. And that's part of what we do as occupational therapists, right? We have to give some foundational skills, the performance skills, and then we have to give them access. And I think if we look at our advocacy part of our code of ethics, we know that we have to advocate. It's our responsibility. And part of that advocacy is really having kids to feel comfortable in their own setting so that they can
Mhm.
access the learning that they need to. Because the gaps, I think one of the biggest things, if we mention that, look, these gaps in academic skills are as early as preschool and in kindergarten. And you can do, certain things to help support a child at a young age and give them more access to decrease dropouts is really important. But I think from a foundational perspective, Nicole, basic comfort is something that we all should have access to. Instead of saying, what is this child, what is happening that's causing their behaviors, we have to say, what does the child's nervous system need to access their curriculum and their play? And I hope that
Mm.
that's enough that compels some people to think, if we look at access, that might be really, somewhere we could start.
Yeah. I like that. I really like that idea of basic comfort.
Hmm.
And I could sell that to a teacher, right? I could say,
Yes.
"You're challenged by so and so. If I
Yes.
can really focus on him or her and their basic comfort, you're gonna be more comfortable too." 'Cause
Yes.
teachers
Yeah.
are they've got a group of kids. We typically have 1. So they
Right.
have it really hard, you know?
Yes, and that's what I often do to increase the buy. And I know I started this even when I started advocating, of course, my own sons, and then I started being an advocate years ago. But yes, when you go into a teacher and say, I know this is happening. I'm here to help support you, but I'm also here to support, Jimmy's participation. And I know that everyone would be it would be great if he would participate in the activities and feel comfortable in the classroom. And you cannot say, no, I don't want him to become. I mean, it's a human instinct to say, yeah, let's support it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the teachers want him to learn too.
Yes, they
Right,
do.
right.
Yeah.
So, I just hear a lot of really great information here. Executive functions, we are not saying it's not challenging.
Right.
And
Oh,
that's why you built this visual model to really support everyone in the process. There's some great research out there to support everyone. You
yes.
have a definition, which I think is grounding. So, and I don't know if we said what the definition is. Do you have a way to
Well,
like kind of
yeah,
share that definition with us so
I
that
do.
everyone feels grounded?
Sure, I do. I don't have it in front of me, but if we think about it this way, so we used to say, and this is like at the front of the book because it's so important to me, and it's all over my website. We can no longer say that executive function is like air traffic control because how many kids and adults have worked in an air traffic control center. So we fully can understand that. We also
Right.
can't say that it's like a CEO of a company because I guarantee no children. Well, I can't guarantee anything, but many children haven't been CEOs. So it doesn't make sense to us. So the definition is that there are both thinking and doing skills. So we initially think executive function, okay, that's planning, organizing, working memory, metacognition, and theory of mind. But really, we need to go back further to the bottom, right? So we're
Mm-hmm.
looking at a bottom up approach here. If you only think of planning and the organization, you're using a
Mm-hmm.
top down approach, which hopefully after listening to this program, you know is not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
But if we look at the bottom up approach, so looking at the interoception, at the regulatory skills, at the child's movement, can the child initiate a task or can they even transition between two tasks? So when we look at the foundational doing skills, I call them, and that's what the research says. When we look at the doing skills, then we start working there at the bottom and then can start building on the higher level skills that we
Mm-hmm.
typically think of as executive functions.
So doing skills kind of sounds like occupational therapy to me, but
Yeah,
you know, and I
I think
think
so.
you're talking about supporting doing, which also sounds like occupational therapy to me.
Uh-huh.
And by the way, I'm going to push back on your kids as CEOs because I had a hot sticker business when I was in elementary school. So
Did you have water stickers?
I made my own with rubber cement and metallic
Ooh, okay,
pens. So
okay.
I'm
So
an
you
80s
might have been
child.
the you're the one CEO. I know people are going to write in. My child's a CEO, so
Right.
I should never say guarantee.
But I think you're right in saying that, we talk in these terms that
Yeah,
are again abstract. So trying to take away the abstraction and make it more
yeah.
concrete is really important. So bringing that back into, I mean, we've been talking about a lot of things. Let's talk maximum impact. I always say this. What would be your top 3 actionable takeaways for therapists who are
Ooh.
listening to put into practice tomorrow?
Oh goodness. Okay, so I think that we need to think about this in the embodied cognition and interoceptive lens. If you're a therapist that doesn't know what interoception is, or if you're not working on that in basic therapy, that it's really critical that you learn and research
Mhm.
and you know look at how that's affecting participation for sure. So the biggest thing I think is that when we look at the movement and how cognition is reflected in our whole body movement, and we are not just looking at executive function as this isolated thinking part, but recognizing that it's emerging from the body's ability to sense and regulate and organize itself in the world. And that's the number one thing is
Mhm.
linking this together, and it doesn't have to be all sensory. It can be timing and music or whatever. And
Mhm.
the one big thing with this model too, Nicole, is that the engineer is us as the therapist. You can use whatever you have in your own toolbox. In other words, if
Mm.
you're DIR floor time, if you're in one that uses, a strict sensory approach, if you're a motor, whatever you are skilled at, you use with that child, but pair it always with interoception. The other thing is that we need to stop judging behavior as good or bad or lazy and looking at when we understand what is happening with the posture or why isn't this child able to
Mhm.
do this, then we're reframing the whole judgmental approach that a lot of times happens to our kids. And
Mhm.
we have to think about their safety, looking at making the world more predictable and comfortable for them. And the
Mhm.
last thing I think is that this isn't going away. That we really can start now and claim our stake. And that doesn't mean that that speech pathologists and PTs can't work on this because I teach physical therapists about timing and executive function as well. But when we shift to supporting regulation and interoception as the foundation for all of our learning, then we're going to start to see real changes. And we're not going to say, oh, this is a behavior referral. We're going to say, this is a child that's telling us something through their actions. And I think this is going to be that's not going away, so we might as well learn it and start building it in practice now.
Yeah. And so, and I think too, you know, that's a really, really good point. I think I want the occupational therapists in particular to kind of appreciate you have the tools to
Mhm.
do this. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yes.
If they don't know the interoception, then they can go back. There's the good thing is, I remember struggling to find anything about
Yes.
interoception when I really needed it. Now there's a ton that you can go learn. There's support tools, there's
Yes.
courses, so it's accessible. But once you understand how to do that and you're making people comfortable and you're helping them with their readiness to be doing, the motor stuff, the sensory stuff. We know all these things that we could use to support them. So, I 100% agree. It's just
Right.
having that definition and having just some understanding about the development and how things work together is going to be very helpful to them.
Right.
But I do kind of want to go back to just real quick in hearing what you're saying about supporting the kids. I think there are kind of two groups. I hear this a lot, that the kids that are maybe less support needs and maybe more of the skill building kids that maybe have stronger language skills, stronger cognitive skills, more of the doing skills, and they have some gaps. I think they're kind of maybe easier to consider how to work with them. But what
Right.
about the kids that need more support? What do you kind of suggest for those kids? Because I think they could get left out of this equation very easily.
Yeah, that is so true. And it's, a lot of our population are kids that are pre-verbal or not speaking yet. And it's really hard for us to think about that. So maybe thinking about using our AAC, our augmentative communication. So when we have a child that is not able to use words, we've got to give them some way to communicate. And that's up to us then as clinicians to say, okay, wait a minute, maybe the child's not able to tell us with words or doesn't yet have that skill, and that's
Mhm.
okay, because part of the interoceptive foundation is, if you look at the hierarchy of it's noticing and then naming in some way, and that could be naming it with just by putting a gesture. But that's then when we go further and attaching meaning to it, it's pretty high level. So when we look back at noticing, that is up to us as clinicians to say, okay, wait, let's look at the physiological signs. So know the physiological signs of stress in the student you're working with, and start to educate the caregiver and teacher about, hey, this is what, Billy has. He starts to clench his jaw, right? So think about it in terms of what you do when you start to feel stress, and try to stop that before it happens. And if we can do that, then we can start with working on predictability and building the routine in. As far as interoception, again, it's about rhythm when you connect it with EF. So building predictability in a schedule and sticking to that as much as possible, and using those increased visuals, and looking at a body first approach here. That movement is also going to be important. So, this is where you can add rhythm. So, again, whatever your method of doing it, whether you're sitting on a ball with your student, and bouncing to a certain rhythm, seeing how music and rhythm in different ways affects the child's body. So, looking at a body first again with these kids that are not able to tell us yet, and we might not ever work on the planning and organization. And that's okay, because if we're building the foundational doing skills, then again, we increase comfort and participation. But
Mhm.
that's where we would start with kids that aren't yet at that, thinking skill. And they may not be there, and they may eventually get there. But the goal for this model isn't that you have to get through the whole model. It's just that we want you to have access to the higher level brain, and that's the eagle brain. So if alligator
Mhm.
and chemical brain is snapping, there's not going to be any thinking that's going on.
Right, right. That's a great way to kind of wrap this up. So, if I were to say, if you had like just one parting word to say or one parting statement to say, to wrap this up, what would it be?
Okay. So be confident in your abilities. Don't, go in and say, I've never done this before. We're never going to get to executive function. Go in there and start. We've got to start tomorrow. That's always the big thing with when I was the pocket OT is like, what is our actionable step, right? And I know this, Nicole, is important to you too, is
Yeah.
what are we going to do now? And that is just building on this. I've got to just reframe my lens. So even if it's just
Mm,
taking off your behavior glasses or and putting on executive function glasses and just start making observations, that's where I would start. Be kind to yourself because this is a whole like a plot twist, we call it, or a track
yeah.
shift
Yeah.
in the model is going from one way to do it to another way. But that would be my first, my best advice. It's just take this and say, okay, let's take a deep breath first and pick one child, or somebody just
Mm,
to start with, and then just shift your observation. Just start with observations and say, wait a minute, now I know what happens before the meltdown, and that's where I would go from here is just to start researching about it and you'll find your way, but remember that you have the skills already. It's just
mhm.
looking at it differently.
So feeling more comfortable
Yes.
in your discomfort with not
Yes.
knowing everything, right? And being like, I can I can build the train as I'm moving it along,
Yes.
right?
And you know what, Nicole? We're both mentors. So we know that professional growth, friends, is
Yeah,
uncomfortable.
it is.
And learning is, again, and that's part of executive function. You said it perfectly right there and you didn't know
Yeah,
it. Part of
yeah.
executive function is changing and adapting. So, yeah,
I love
well
it.
said.
Well, well, thank you so much. That's all the time that we have for today. And I want to thank Dr. Cara Koscinski again for all her insight, her practice related takeaways related to executive function, and sharing her executive function train model with us. So thank you, Dr. Koscinski.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I love that you're taking the initiative, MedBridge and Nicole, to look at this and really help clinicians to understand it. Thank you.
Yeah, choo choo. Bye, everybody. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Pediatric Pioneers by MedBridge. Please be sure to subscribe and listen to more of our episodes on Spotify or on your favorite podcast platform and at medbridge.com. If you're listening outside of the MedBridge catalog and would like to access the bonus resources and receive continuing education credit, simply log into your MedBridge account and complete the quiz for this episode. Pediatric Pioneers also listens to you. If there is a particular practitioner that you'd like to hear from, or if you have a question or challenge that you'd like to explore on this podcast, please let us know by leaving a comment on our Instagram post or by emailing podcast@medbridge.com.